Donald Trump has been in office for 100 days and is creating new threats for our democracy every single day. Senator Chris Murphy is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Senator Chris Murphy, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. So you have been a very clear voice in the fight for democracy. Trump has been in office now 100 days. And so I want to start by just asking you kind of an open-ended question. Like, what do you make of where we stand at this point and moving forward?
Well, I think the moment is dire, and I am very worried that there are far too many leaders in the Democratic Party, far too many members of our coalition who think this is politics as normal. Um, Trump is engaged in a really well planned out, coordinated attempt to destroy our democracy. A lot of folks are waiting for this big, high stakes, high profile confrontation between Trump and the Supreme Court. And whether the Abrego Garcia case is it or not, I'm not sure. But I don't think that democracy needs to have that Supreme Court executive branch confrontation to wither on the vine. What Trump's doing to try to destroy the traditional means of accountability in a democratic government, the universities where protest is midwifed and objective truth is protected, the legal profession where your constitutional rights are advanced, the press where the truth is told. Those are all under attack, and it could be that between those institutions becoming weaker and Trump commandeering enough of the ways in which information travels on social media, between his control of Twitter and his potential pending control of TikTok, that we might not have a free and fair election in 2026. Now, I think that is still up to us. We still have more people that love democracy than there are that support Trump's efforts to destroy it. But he is really trying to get us to a point where we look and feel like one of these fake democracies where we still have elections, but the opposition party is just kept weak enough, dissent is subverted just enough so that only one party, Trump's party, wins those elections.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and it's one that I've made that people ask me, is there a chance we won't have elections? And I say, no, we're going to have elections. Like there's not going to not be an election day in 2026. The question is for us right now is how free, how fair they will be. Like, and that is, as you say, not a foregone conclusion. It's not. I'm not dire about this. I'm not like give up, like everybody stay home, it doesn't matter. But I'm also not like it's definitely going to happen. So I think there's a lot of work for the pro-democracy movement to do between here and there. I do have a question for you about kind of where we have been in the power grab phase of this before we get to the free and fair election phase. And I kind of look at what Trump has done in kind of three buckets, but I know you've thought more about this, frankly, than almost anyone. There is what he's trying to do to affect sort of culture, right? Like the media, online discourse and the like. There's what he's doing to try to control the executive branch, purging the civil service. And then there's what he's doing to essentially seize power from other branches of government, mostly Congress. And I'm just curious, is that how you think about this? Or is there a unifying theory to those? Is one more important than the other? Like, how do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I haven't necessarily thought about it in those buckets. I think everything is in service of trying to rule forever. It's not just about that he wants more power or that he doesn't like Congress. What he's trying to do is transform the tools that he has available to him so that he can command an extraordinary amount of loyalty. The reason that the founding fathers, one of the reasons that the founding fathers, were very protective of lodging the spending power in the legislature is because they saw what a king did, a monarch did, when they had full control over the treasury. What you did is you used both your spending and your tax power to reward people loyal to you and punish people who were disloyal to you. I mean, that is literally what the American Revolution is about, the use of taxation power in order to compel loyalty from a part of the kingdom that had no representation over how spending was allocated. So the founding fathers said, okay, we're going to give spending power to the legislature, where every geography and every faction is represented, they will come to a decision on how to allocate spending that will be fair and that won't be used as a political loyalty test. Trump's grabbing the spending power, I don't think because he just wants to make spending decisions. He doesn't give a crap about how money is spent. He doesn't know anything about the federal budget. He's grabbing control of the spending power because he knows that if everybody's dependent on him for whether they get their government money or not, then many of them will just sign up to be loyal to him, will stop protesting, and that it will serve his ultimate end, which is to never leave power, or at least to have MAGA or the Trump family never leave power.
So you gave a floor speech literally a short time ago, as I understand it, about how corruption fits into this. So we don't oftentimes hear the connection between the corruption of Donald Trump and the administration and the democracy parts of this. So I'm curious if that's something you have thought through, what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an overlapping story there, but there are sort of distinct storylines. I mean, it is true that Donald Trump just also wants to use the White House to make himself even more filthy rich and to make his family more filthy rich. So the Trump coin scandal is a scandal. It's a little bit of a democracy scandal because you have, well, it's more than a little bit. It's a democracy scandal because you have people going around the traditional means of influencing government
Right.
by sending money to Trump through the meme coin to try to curry favor with him. But it is mostly a story about Trump just trying to use the power he has as president to become rich. You saw last week he announced that he was going to give secret VIP tours to the top 25 investors in his meme coin. I mean, that's just a brazen act of corruption, and the point there is to just make himself very, very rich. But a lot of the corruption is about, again, operationalizing the White House to guarantee more loyalty, the way in which DOJ is being used to let off allies of Trump who've engaged in corruption, or the way that the SEC is dropping lawsuits, or DOL is dropping investigations against companies or individuals who have declared their loyalty to Trump. That corruption is in service of the president's power objective. So a little bit of just ordinary financial make myself rich corruption mixed in with a lot of pervert the Constitution and the law to advance my own power and stay in power corruption.
Join me this Thursday, May 1st, for a live virtual event with Sky Perryman, Hannah Freed, and Harry Littman. We'll break down Donald Trump's first 100 days, the problems our democracy faces, and how we fix it. Register for free at the link above or in the description below. So I have to ask you a backstory question that, I'm really interested in. I think most people came to know you as one of the smartest, if not the smartest, and the most passionate people on the issue of guns and the challenge that gun violence pose to America. I mean, you have been working tirelessly, and people who have not followed your work should know. I mean, Senator Murphy has worked day in, day out when the spotlight is away from the scene. He has worked to deal with the scourge of gun violence. And that, I assume, comes in part from the tragedy that took place in Connecticut many years ago. And you have now adopted that same sort of workhorse, like just doggedness. I mean, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the time you've been spending in rural red places in America at town halls, but you've adopted that same dogged sort of attack mentality around the issue of democracy. And I'm curious if there is a connection to those two things, or if it's just these are the crises that that came to you, and it's the moment you find yourself in, and that's just the through line.
Yeah, first of all, that's a very generous characterization of my work in the anti-gun violence movement. There's an enormous number of heroes in that movement. Of course, we finally, 10 years after Sandy Hook, were able to pass the most significant gun violence bill in our country's history, signed by President Biden. And by the way, I don't ever miss an opportunity to make this advertisement. Since we passed that bill, gun violence rates and mass shooting rates in this country have dropped by 20, 30, 40% in most places. We've saved a lot of lives because of the movement we built. To the extent that there's a connection, maybe it's twofold. One, I just know how to build political movements and operations. I didn't, I might have been the highest profile member of the Congress or the Senate on the issue of guns, but I built it together with a whole bunch of people from virtually nothing when Sandy Hook happened to be one of the most powerful political groups in the country, such that we finally beat the gun lobby after 30 years of the gun lobby being in charge. And so this movement, the movement to save our democracy, I mean, we weren't starting from zero, but the threats Trump is making are pretty exceptional. And I think that one of the things I'm good at is helping to build those coalitions. There is a connection, though, on the substance as well, Mark, and one that you'll really understand given the work that you've done around protecting voters from threats of violence. What has always been key to a demagogue in waiting, an elected leader who wants to be in power forever, is the endorsement of violence, the threat of violence, sort of hanging over elections, hanging over political action. Yeah, you can come out and protest me, but you might get the crap beat out of you if you do. That's what Donald Trump is doing. Donald Trump is, through the pardoning of all the January 6th protesters, sending a signal that if you engage in violence on my behalf, you'll be okay. That's part of the dictator or wannabe autocrat's playbook. And of course, that is a story that I know very well because, violence gets covered when it actually happens. But a lot of violence in this nation is coercive. In the domestic violence world, for the number of women who actually get shot, there are 100 more who are just in a relationship where a gun is present, and they are essentially under the control of a partner who is constantly threatening, overtly or implicitly, lethal violence. So I know how violence is used to try to change and compel behavior, and that's what Trump is trying to do as he tries to convert our democracy to something very different.
So I assume that one of the lessons or that you learned, or one of the tactics that you developed in that experience, where you had to convince people who are not just, people like me who are, lifelong Democrats, support reasonable gun control efforts and but you had to reach out and find ways to communicate with people who didn't start from that premise. And so I'm really fascinated because you have been going around the country to various places, like in Missouri and in North Carolina. I know a fair bit about the North Carolina congressional map. I litigated the North Carolina congressional map, and you went to a pretty red place. I mean, not a place that is like where Democrats normally. It's not the first congressional district, which is held by a Democrat, but it's a swing district. You went to a pretty red place, and I'm just curious, what your what I don't want to say what the point is, because I understand what the point is around democracy, but let's start with this. What's the reception you get in those audiences, whether it's on democracy or guns or whatever, and what is the strategy when you're in those rooms to try to convince people of the importance of these issues?
Yeah, last week I was in Saxpahaw, North Carolina at the Haw River Ballroom. The next night I was in Chesterfield, Missouri, real red country there. And on this message, I mean, we really are trying to stay out of the politics in the sense that, there are plenty of, traditional Trump voters who believed Donald Trump when he said he was going to care about prices, and they didn't believe him when he said he was going to be a dictator. And they're figuring out that the opposite is true. In fact, he doesn't care about prices at all. He's doing everything he can to make prices higher. And he actually is pretty focused on trying to become a dictator. And there are a lot of deeply conservative people in North Carolina and Missouri who aren't in for that project, aren't in for the intentional cratering of our economy, aren't in for the destruction of our democracy. And, our message when we go to these red places is that, you may still have some differences with Democrats on, choice or gay rights or guns or climate, but, it's kind of an emergency moment. And, maybe in the short run, you should sign up for our project, which is, basically just to save our democracy. And, we can litigate those other differences somewhere else, which is kind of what we did on guns. We said, for instance, you may not agree with me on assault weapons. You might still want assault weapons to be legal, but you want background checks, right? You want that boyfriend loophole closed so that the domestic abusers can't get their hands on guns. That's how we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, because when we sat down in the room with our conservative Republican negotiating partners, we said, let's just set aside our differences on assault weapons or universal background checks. And let's, work in the realm of the possible. Right now, the realm of the possible is saving democracy, fighting this corruption. And we're going to get a lot of partners, at least for the time being. And maybe if a bunch of Republicans or MAGA supporters come in and get to know us a little better, they'll find out that he's a fake populist, that we're real populists, and that we might have differences on a handful of hot button issues. There's more alignment than folks on his side think there are with progressive Democrats.
Yeah. So one of the places where it does not appear you're getting any cooperation is with Republicans in Congress. So it feels like the Republicans in the House and even the Republicans in the Senate are either because they are afraid or because they view their political fortunes. I don't know what it is, but they seem to be more lockstep behind Donald Trump than ever before. And I am curious why you think that is. I had on a congressman who said that he thought that some of the Republican members were physically afraid. I think actually Senator Murkowski of Alaska actually alluded to that in a town hall that she did in Alaska. I've had others say that, look, they risk primary challenges and they are afraid that they're going to lose their next election. Do you have a sense of why Republicans in Congress seem so much just in lockstep with him?
Yeah, I think that those are overly generous explanations. Like that sort of is built off of the assumption that they know what the right thing is and they aren't doing the right thing. I actually don't find that by and large with Republicans in the House and the Senate. And this is heartbreaking, and I wish it weren't true. But I think the majority of Republicans in Congress are signed up to put Trump in power forever. I think the mainstream of the Republican Party believes exactly what Donald Trump believes, that progressive Democrats are the number one threat to the United States and that any means justifies our complete and total elimination. They've been sucked into this really weird right-wing ecosystem in which they believe that we are evil. They have been told that democracy is really not worth it. And it's kind of weak in a globe today where autocrats can move much more quickly. There's been a lot of intellectual work done inside the sort of MAGA infrastructure to explain why democracy is dead as a political concept. So there are a handful of Republicans in the Senate who, want the democracy to stick around and aren't doing the right thing because they're afraid of Donald Trump. But most of the Republicans in Congress actually are pretty much signed up for getting rid of American democracy. They are out of step with the American people, but they are actually living their truth, not hiding their truth.
Yeah, it's interesting, something you said that I want to emphasize to people, and if you have more to add, I'd love to hear it. But, there is a right-wing ideological movement among elites that basically says what you just said, that we shouldn't have that liberal democracy is bad, that, what we really want is a strongman, leader like Donald Trump, that there should not be limits on how long he can serve or what his power is, and that would actually be preferable. And that J.D. Vance actually was a senator who was very closely sort of aligned with some of the thinking. I'm not going to say that he didn't support elections or whatever, but he was definitely flirting in that right-wing ecosystem, which is very online, very very present. And so it's interesting that, you're saying that, something I associated with one Republican senator, maybe has more currency more generally among Republicans in Congress.
Yeah, there has been, a real attempt to delegitimize democracy. The theory is that, in today's world where you have autocrats in Beijing and Moscow who can move much more nimbly than a democracy can, um, America can only survive if you have, what they kind of call a CEO model, which is
Right.
just kind of a kinder, friendlier.
This is Curtis Yarvin.
This is Yarvin's, and Yarvin probably gets a little bit more attention than he deserves. But, the whole work inside the Claremont Institute, for instance, which is, much bigger, more well-funded and mainstream, is, also in service of that broader attack on democracy. And again, if you listen to, candidates like, Blake Masters, who was, kind of out of that same school, that they sort of maybe are, in their hearts a little reluctant to directly attack democracy, but they do think that Democrats are evil. And so they feel like if you have to get rid of democracy in order to get rid of Democrats, I guess that's just the price you have to pay. And so both those strains are, very real and very alive. And I think that's, for me, the reason why I was seized right from the start with this project Donald Trump was employing to try to undermine our democracy, because I had watched, I've gone pretty deep into that sort of world of the online new right, and that distaste for democracy is very big, very alive, very robust, and it just told me that this was not a mistake, that this was all a very purposeful campaign to try to convert American democracy to something else.
Yeah. So I said we were going to go back to free and fair elections. My own view is that there are only two checks on Donald Trump right now, that he focuses on. One is the courts, which we are seeing do what they can do, but the courts are not set up to be the founders thought the legislature would be the check on Trump, not the courts, right? Thought that Congress would protect its prerogatives. It never envisioned a speaker like Mike Johnson turning over the gavel to Donald Trump. It never assumed that someone like John Thune would simply have his caucus line up to confirm every nominee, no matter what, right? So we're left with the courts, and everyone understands, I think, to some extent, what's going on there. That there is a bit of a dance going on right now between Donald Trump does illegal things, the court strikes down illegal things, the administration complies-ish with some of them, plays dumb and cat and mouse with others. Maybe we get to a place where they are in open contempt, we'll see. But the other check that I have argued that Donald Trump cares most about are free and fair elections. Like, at the core of MAGAism, at the core of Donald Trump, is election denialism. Right? It is the one irreducible minimum. As I sometimes say, you can have someone who is pro-free trade and they can be in the Trump administration. They may not be right now in power, but they're in the administration. You can have a former pro-choice Democrat be the cabinet secretary for HHS. The one thing that is unforgivable, that you simply cannot do in Donald Trump's world, is be in favor of free and fair elections and say that he lost the 2020 election. So that's my perspective on this. So as I look out to 2026, I think, okay, the place where Donald Trump will once again pivot to, where the Republican voter suppression war machine has still been going on, it has not stopped. The RNC is still in court all over the place trying to prevent free and fair elections, is this. And so I'm wondering, sitting from your perch in the Senate, obviously you have the Republican SAVE Act. I assume it's not going to pass in the Senate, but what do you see as the trigger points or the fights around free and fair elections that people should be paying attention to?
Well, and I mean, obviously, we are all, in deep debt and gratitude to you and your team for everything that you have done to protect free and fair elections. We wouldn't be in the position we are without your work. So I feel a little silly, telling you what I think should be done to protect our elections. But yes, you're right that the SAVE Act, which is, as I understand it, essentially, boils down to the handover of state elections to the federal government, to the Trump administration, to decide who can vote and when. That's not going to pass the Senate, but Trump is obviously going to try to push through as much of it as he can through executive order. And there will be a confrontation between the court and the president, likely, as to how much of that he can do and how much of that he can't do. And that might be the most important confrontation between the court and the president. Not that these immigration cases aren't important, because we can't have a president who can imprison or deport anybody he wants, but we cannot let Donald Trump decide who gets to vote in Connecticut or Texas or Missouri or North Carolina. Those are state decisions. I, as I mentioned before, focus, on this question of election security
Yeah.
and free and fair elections. But I think it's just as important, if not more important, to focus on these institutions, the press, the lawyers, the legal profession, and the campuses, and also sort of the not-for-profit community, which tends to be pretty politically active, and Trump is attempting to silence them as well. Really important to help them engage in the kind of collective action that will allow them to stay what they are, which are guardians of democracy, guardians of the truth. And without them, I don't know that you can have a free and fair election if students can't protest on campuses, if the journalists refuse to tell the truth, if the lawyers are afraid of enforcing our rights broadly and more specifically our voting rights. So that's why I really put a lot of my focus on what I call those institutions of democratic accountability and keeping them open for business.
So let's talk about those in what, again, I think is a framework that I think about it, and I'm curious if you agree or don't agree. It seems to me we've seen two dominant themes around those institutions. The first is that where they are able to collectively resist, they are more successful than where they are divided, right? So the law firms have done a terrible job, in my view, because they got divided very early. Paul Weiss made a deal, they went after my former law firm largely because of my presence there in the past, and they fought, and then Paul Weiss capitulated, and that then created the schism, and it has made the law firms less effective, in my view, in standing up to Donald Trump, because even the ones who have not been targeted are quiet, right? They are taking a step back because they are afraid. It feels like the universities actually have been smarter about this and have actually rallied more as a collective whole, and that is perhaps going to suit them better. So that to me strikes me as one lesson. The other, which is probably more controversial and maybe not correct, I haven't really thought this all the way through, is that maybe smaller is better. I mean, like, I'm just curious. I don't want to put you in the middle of a Connecticut home state rivalry here, but maybe Connecticut College is actually in a better position to resist than the University of Connecticut, right? Because like it's a small college and a very well regarded college, by the way, in Connecticut, and it doesn't have perhaps all of the intertanglements with research spending and the like. And so that small law firms are better positioned than large law firms, small media outlets better than large media outlets, small colleges or the large universities. I don't know whether that's true or not. I have nothing empirical to say that that's true, but I'm curious if either of those two, this collective sticking together, makes sense to you, the small versus large makes sense to you, or if you have a different way to urge civil society groups to resist Trump.
Yeah, I guess I really shudder to think about there being a solution to the second problem. I mean, I just don't want to be in a world where your only recourse, and I know you're not suggesting this, but sort
Yeah,
of, your only recourse is to kind of hide, right?
right.
And to get small enough or to
I'm
find a dark.
definitely against that. I'm definitely anti-hiding and getting
Yeah, yeah,
smaller.
yeah, but like, right, to get sort of small enough that nobody notices what you're doing. And listen, there are just some things. I'm actually not a big fan of big institutions. I would actually love our entire economy to be sort of smaller, more broken up, and more local. But it is true that there are, some big projects that only big universities can take
Right.
on. I mean, some of the most massive breakthroughs in modern history, including nuclear technology, could only happen in big integrated research universities. So I just don't think that can be the ultimate solution. But of course, your first observation is spot on. And I think our discussion now has to be, what can we do to support that kind of collective action? It may be that what Harvard did in sort of being the first big institution to just say no, I'm not cutting a deal with you, which helped then rally the other
Yeah,
universities to their side. That may go down as one of the most important acts in
I
the
agree.
in the sort of in the present day history of our efforts to save our democracy. But Harvard is Harvard. I mean, they have the endowment to do that.
I would warn you. You are the senator from Connecticut, so you should be careful about praising Harvard.
Yeah, well, in the end, my service to democracy is more important than my service to my state. So I'll give Harvard its due, as long as Yale
I was going to say,
sticks to their
give Yale a shout out here.
sticks to their guns and does the right thing. But how do you help um, others who don't have as big an endowment? How do you support not for profits that don't have money under the mattress, and if they lose one quarter of funding, they might end up going under? How do you create a support structure so that an institution that's going through a hard time can bind together with others? In the collective bargaining world, that's called a strike fund, right? You
Hmm.
raise money and you squirrel it away so that it can be used to support your employees when they go on strike, when they lose their paychecks. And each industry may have to think of an ad hoc arrangement like that would make collective action a little bit easier to take on. And we are, quite honestly, in our office, thinking of ways that we can support For instance, municipalities and not-for-profits in Connecticut who are thinking about collective action, thinking about how we can support them legally, how we can help them support each other financially. That's, I think, the most important conversation that's happening, and it's vital.
All right. In the few remaining moments I have with you, I've got to ask you, people see you on TV and they are inspired. They see you doing all these things and they're grateful. But the biggest question I get, and I'm sure as a senator, when you travel probably around the country, but certainly in Connecticut, when you're around your neighbors or your neighborhood, people want to know what they can do because they feel powerless, right? They feel like overwhelmed by this all. And they're thinking, well, I'm not a US senator. I don't have this national platform. I can't be involved in the issues of the day. I feel terrified, but mostly I feel overwhelmed by it all. So what do you tell your constituents, that person who asks you, what can they do? Why, what should they be doing who just feels hopeless?
I tell them that it's not rocket science, and that the tools to resist autocracy haven't changed in 100 years. It is action. It is waking up every day and deciding that you are going to do one single thing that day to fight back. One day it may be something big, like showing up to a town hall or a rally. Other days it may be something small, like calling a Republican congressman's office or just reaching out to a friend to explain to them the stakes of the latest corruption scandal. What has happened in the last few weeks is pretty extraordinary. Trump's approval ratings, which had been in the high 40s, have come down to 40 or below. And when a president's approval ratings get that low, his collaborators, his enablers start to get a little bit of cold feet as our buzzer goes off for a vote. And so what people are doing right now, showing up in these enormous numbers, it is working. It is softening Trump's support. It is creating an atmosphere in which less of his Republican colleagues are willing to support him. And as I said to the people I was talking to in Missouri and North Carolina, even though you may feel more powerless in a red state or a red district, it's actually the opposite. You're actually more powerful. What started to tip the balance here, what caused Trump's numbers to spiral downwards, were the turnout in red districts. Because some people who have a lot of conservative friends or live in conservative areas, they feel like, well, there's this story in California and Connecticut and New York, and then there's this story in the place that I live. And they're two different stories. But then when you start to see, your neighbors turning out for town halls to harass your Republican congressman or showing up at their office to demand that they answer for, their support for corruption, then you start to say, oh, wait a second. This is a thing where I live too. I can start being more vocal. There's a permission structure. So just show up. I mean, I'm around people. Everybody said that they were going to pass the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. You remember this, Mark, in
Oh yeah,
2017.
sure.
And they didn't. And it was simple. We just made too much noise. We made so much noise that 3 Republicans, and that's all that we needed, decided to vote against it. They're going to try to do the same thing here. They're going to try to throw millions of people off of Medicaid in order to fund another tax cut for the wealthy. And all we need is 3 or 4 Republicans to vote against it. Noise can make that happen. So I think what we're doing is slowly working. And I think people just need to decide to do one small thing every day.
Okay. And so I'm going to ask you the flip side question. When a Republican comes up to you who says, look, I don't agree with you on anything. I don't agree with your position on guns. I don't agree with you on abortion. But I am worried about, I don't think that U.S. citizens should be shipped out of the country. I'm worried about due process. I agree prices don't seem to be going down. They're going up. How should Democrats, because a lot of the people who watch these videos and who follow Democracy Docket and follow you, they're Democrats. Like, what advice do you give us for how to interact? Like, how do you interact with that person who you said you meet, who say, they don't agree with you on your position on, on some things? Like, how do you address them on the democracy issue?
Yeah, I mean, to give a sort of short-term tactical answer and a long-term sort of strategic answer. Listen, I think you can offer folks a temporary alliance structure. That these next 2 elections, 2026 and 2028 elections, are going to decide whether American democracy survives. And for you, in the long run, for your family, you want to be living in a democracy. Look at these autocracies over the world. Their economies are half the size on a per capita basis. It is not fun looking over your shoulder all the time if you say something that's out of step with the regime. Form a temporary alliance with us for the next couple of years. If you want to go back to voting Republican after Trump is gone, that's something that you can do or can consider. But this project is a little bit more important. The broader advice I have for the party is, we have shrunk our coalition over the years. We've shrunk our coalition for a couple reasons. One, we became very litmus testy. We said, if you want to be a member of our party or a member of our movement, you've got to sign up with us, not just on the economics, but on abortion and gay rights and guns and climate. And I just think that we should be a party that offers a little bit less judgment on those hot button issues. If you're with us on democracy and you're with us on sort of the broad idea of populist economics, that we're going to put more power in the poor and the middle class instead of in the rich, then we want you as part of our tent. And then, instead of defending the existing version of democracy, be really loud about reform. It's really been 20 years, Mark, and I know you lead this fight, but I mean, I think you would admit that, there was a time when campaign finance reform was a top, 3 issue for us as a party. And, at times we have engaged in conversations about voting rights, but it's been a long time since we ran really strongly as a party on getting private money, corporate money, totally out of politics. I think that now has to be like a 1 or 2 issue for Democrats, because I think the only way that people broadly, including Republicans, will be on board with our project to save democracy is if we're offering a different version of democracy where our democracy has been unrigged, and that the billionaires and the corporations have a ton less power and regular people have more power. So explain to people, including those Republicans who are thinking about signing up with us, that if you put us in power, we'll pass the Stock Act. No more stock trading by members of Congress. We'll close the revolving door. We will offer a constitutional amendment to allow Congress or state legislatures to ban private billionaire money from politics. I think that's a message that can resonate.
Senator Chris Murphy, you are an amazing force to be reckoned with in the U.S. Senate, a hero on the fight for democracy, and thank you for being here.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for everything you do.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters to stay informed on the latest voting rights and democracy news. We'll see you next time.